Get off my property right now. The HOA president was screaming at me like I was some kind of criminal. Her voice cut through the quiet evening like glass shattering against stone. 3 black SUVs blocked my escape from the dirt driveway, their headlights glaring into my inherited cabin as if they were stage lights exposing me to an audience I never signed up for. I had lost everything in my divorce. The house, the marriage, even the dog. All I had left was this cabin, an old wooden place tucked at the edge of the neighborhood left to me by Uncle Jim. It wasn't much, but it was supposed to be my fresh start. Only Mary Pierce, the self-proclaimed queen of this HOA kingdom, decided from day one that I didn't belong here. She was 5'2", but walked like she towered over the world. Perfect hair, blazer too stiff for the dusty road she was standing on, and a thick folder clutched in her hands like it contained the law of the land. She waved those papers like a judge handing down a sentence. These documents clearly outline the liability issues with deceased property owners, she announced, her voice rehearsed, polished, dripping with the kind of fake authority you only get by practicing in the mirror 100 times. You need legal verification of your inheritance rights before you can occupy this residence. There are covenant violations that must be addressed immediately. She said it like I was some squatter who stumbled into the wrong yard, not a man holding on to the last piece of his family's legacy. And while her words echoed, I remember the smell of pine sap in the air, the creak of the front gate swinging in the breeze, and the weight of dust on my boots that made me feel small but grounded. Then Rebecca Shaw appeared. If Mary was the hammer, Rebecca was the silk rope. She stepped forward with this too-perfect smile, the kind that looked warm on the surface but cold underneath. "I'm an estate planning specialist," she said softly, extending her hand as if we were old friends. "I actually helped your Uncle Jim with his final arrangements. Such a wonderful man, though I worried about how he adjusted to living alone in his final months." The way she tilted her head when she said it, it wasn't compassion. It was evaluation. She asked me questions that sounded helpful, but every one of them cut too deep. How was I handling the divorce financially? Was I working full-time? Did I have family support? Her words weren't small talk. They were scalpel cuts building a psychological profile. And right behind her came Kevin Torres, tall, broad-shouldered, ex-military. You could see it in his stance, in the way his eyes scanned the tree line before he even said a word. "I'm handling community security," he declared, shoulders back, trying to sound like a protector. But when he spoke, there was a desperate edge, like a man clinging to a title he didn't really hold. Within an hour, the so-called welcoming committee finally left. I stood there in silence until Frank Morrison, my uncle's old neighbor, shuffled across the grass. 70s, tired eyes, hands that trembled when he spoke. "I failed your uncle," he whispered, his voice thick with regret. "Jim kept telling me something was wrong with that Rebecca woman, said she was always poking around, asking questions about his property, about his will. I thought he was just getting paranoid. I didn't believe him. And that regret, it hung between us heavier than the mountain air. Later, as the crickets started up and the last light slipped from the windows, I sat at my uncle's old desk, sorting through stacks of papers that smelled faintly of dust and coffee. That's when I found it, an envelope tucked deep in the bottom drawer, my name written in his shaky handwriting. Reading that letter was like having my uncle reach out from the grave, his voice trembling through every word. "Charles, if you're reading this, I failed to protect what matters most. Rebecca Shaw has been planning something for years. She destroyed my peace, made neighbors think I was losing my mind. Don't trust anyone until you understand what's happening. Check the old survey documents in the basement. You'll understand why they want this land so badly. Time is running out." I remember sitting back in that creaky chair, the wood pressing into my shoulders, the silence so thick it felt alive. Divorce had left me broken, but this was something else. This wasn't just grief. This was danger. Rebecca's questions weren't neighborly. Mary's authority wasn't just HOA bluster. And Kevin, he wasn't just a watchman. Something bigger was moving under the surface, and my uncle had died trying to warn me. I folded the letter carefully, slid it back into its envelope, and reached for the flashlight hanging by the door. My hand shook, not from fear exactly, but from the realization that whatever was waiting for me in that basement was the real reason they wanted me gone. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of the screen door rattling in the wind. The cabin felt colder than usual, though maybe that was just me, knowing what lay waiting in the basement. Uncle Jim's letter had set my nerves on fire, but curiosity pushed me forward. I grabbed my flashlight, the kind with scratches down its side from years of use, and stepped down the wooden stairs. Each creak under my boots echoed louder than it should have. Dust floated in the air, catching in the beam of light. The smell was a mix of mildew and old paper, the kind of scent you only find in places that have been sealed too long. There in a corner sat metal containers, waterproof, labeled in my uncle's handwriting. Beside them, rolled maps, surveyor's tools, the kind of equipment you'd expect in a county office, not a retired man's basement. I unfolded one of the maps across the workbench. The lines didn't make sense at first, but the more I traced them with my finger, the more my stomach sank. This wasn't just a cabin on a patch of woods. The property stretched farther, down toward the road, past the community center, the playground, even the HOA maintenance shed. My uncle had been sitting on land that the entire neighborhood used without permission for years. And now it was mine. Before I could process the weight of that, I heard a knock upstairs. Sharp, too deliberate. When I opened the door, Rebecca Shaw stood there with a casserole dish, smiling like a Sunday school teacher. "Moving is stressful," she cooed. "I thought you could use some comfort food." It smelled good, chicken maybe, but the way she held it out, the way her eyes searched mine, it didn't feel like kindness. It felt like bait. She leaned against the doorframe, talking casually but with surgical precision. "I imagine the divorce was difficult. The legal fees, the settlement, transitions like that can be financially draining." I froze. I had never told anyone here about the details of my divorce. Not a soul. Yet she spoke like she'd read my court records. That's when it hit me. Rebecca didn't just ask questions. She already knew the answers. She was confirming them. Over the next few days, she made her rounds. Homemade bread to one neighbor. Fresh cookies to another. Every visit was wrapped in kindness, but every conversation was the same, gathering intel, planting seeds. A woman next door later admitted Rebecca had asked her about my job, my mental health, whether I seemed stable. Rebecca wasn't a neighbor. She was building a case file. And she wasn't doing it alone. Mary, with her HOA title, had the authority to make things official. Kevin, with his military discipline, had the eyes and ears. Together, they weren't just neighbors. They were a machine. Frank Morrison showed up again one evening, his eyes heavy, his hands gripping a stack of papers. He spread them across my kitchen table, the surface scratched from years of my uncle's coffee mugs. "I went through some of Jim's things I'd stored," he said quietly. I didn't believe him before, but now. The papers were logs, detailed, careful notes Uncle Jim had kept about Rebecca. Dates, conversations, even word-for-word quotes. He'd written how she showed up during his chemo treatments when he was weakest, how she'd offered to help with legal papers while suggesting maybe his medicine was clouding his judgment, how she'd whispered that neighbors were concerned about his ability to handle the property, that she was the only one on his side. Reading those pages made my throat tighten. My uncle hadn't been paranoid, he'd been hunted. And as I sat there, piecing together his words with the maps in the basement, I realized Rebecca wasn't improvising. She had a system. The next blow came when my boss called me into his office. He leaned back in his chair, looking at me like I was a puzzle he couldn't solve. "I got a strange call," he said. "A woman from your neighborhood said she was doing a character reference check. Wanted to know if you'd ever shown signs of instability, if you'd brought your personal issues into work." Rebecca had gone after my job. And she was clever about it, never outright accusing me, always framing it as concern. She wasn't just trying to poison my neighbors against me. She was isolating me from every support I had left. That night, I found more of Uncle Jim's notes hidden in an old photo album. The first entries were cautious. New neighbor Rebecca Shaw moved in 2 weeks after my cancer diagnosis. Too many questions about inheritance. But the later notes, they chilled me. He'd tracked her history. She'd done this before, moved into 3 other communities in 2 different states. Always right after someone got sick, always inserting herself as an expert. always circling the most vulnerable until the land was pried from their hands. The final note, written just months before his death, was barely legible. "Rebecca is not a neighbor. She's a predator. I am too weak to fight, but maybe Charles will." I remember sitting there, the photo album open, the air thick with dust. My uncle had been documenting a criminal, and now she'd set her sights on me. The next morning, Rebecca struck harder. She held what she called a community safety meeting. Parents gathered in living rooms while she spoke in hushed, professional tones about the dangers of recently divorced men. She used my divorce, my therapy, even a dismissed restraining order from years ago, twisting them into proof I was unstable. She told them she wasn't saying I was dangerous, but planted just enough doubt that they'd start watching me like a threat. And it worked. Conversations on the street quieted when I walked by. Kids who used to ride bikes near my driveway were suddenly kept away. Neighbors avoided eye contact. The isolation had begun. That evening, Frank returned, his voice heavy with guilt. "Your uncle knew. He saw it all. He left everything in that basement to protect you, and I think it's time you saw the full picture." We went down together, the flashlight beam dancing across survey maps and waterproof files. What we uncovered wasn't just paperwork, it was dynamite. Uncle Jim hadn't just left me a cabin, he'd left me leverage. Land, 6 acres of it, including the community center, the playground, the maintenance shed, everything the HOA had built its authority around. No wonder they wanted me gone. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't just fighting for survival. I was sitting on the very ground that gave them power. They thought they had me cornered. What Mary Pierce didn't know was that the ground she stood on wasn't hers at all. The day after Frank and I discovered Uncle Jim's survey maps, I called in a licensed surveyor. A man named Jim Bradley showed up, tall, quiet, no-nonsense, lugging equipment that looked like it belonged on a NASA mission. He set up tripods, scanned boundaries, checked county records. For 3 hours, I watched him work while sipping stale coffee from a chipped mug on the porch, Frank sitting beside me, chain-smoking like it was the only thing holding him together. When Bradley finally came over with his clipboard, I could tell by the look on his face that whatever he was about to say was going to change everything. "Well, Mr. Moore," he began, his tone clipped and professional. "According to county records, your inheritance isn't just this cabin and the immediate lot. You legally own 6.2 acres. He tapped the map with his pen, tracing the lines that cut through places I never expected. "Your property stretches to the main road, east past the community center, and includes the land under the playground, mailbox facility, and the HOA maintenance shed." The words hung in the air like thunder. 6 acres, and everything they'd been lording over me sat right on top of it. I stared at the paper, the surveyor's pen still hovering over those lines, and for a second I couldn't breathe. For 16 years, the HOA had been running its operations, collecting dues, holding meetings, on land that wasn't theirs. It was mine. Mary Pierce had been barking at me about rules and violations, while squatting on my family's property. News spread fast. Gossip in this community traveled quicker than wildfire in dry brush. By sundown, neighbors were buzzing. Some were furious, others terrified. Parents who once whispered that I was unstable now realized their kids had been playing on a playground that belonged to me. Families paying HOA fees found out they'd been maintaining buildings the HOA didn't even own. The emergency meeting Mary called that night was chaos. I didn't attend, but I heard enough from the street. Raised voices, accusations, panic. Some shouted for rent collection, others demanded answers. Property values, community identity, everything was suddenly in jeopardy. Rebecca Shaw, of course, pivoted faster than anyone. The sweet casserole-carrying neighbor was gone. In her place was a strategist. She started flooding inboxes with community impact briefs. Charts, bullet points, colorful graphs that made me look like a predator waiting to exploit the community. She painted a picture of me as a landlord who could charge back rent, shut down their playground, or evict their beloved community center overnight. And people believed her, because fear is louder than facts. Mary, never one to miss her stage time, stood in front of that crowd like a general rallying troops. "This man is holding our children's safety hostage for money," she declared, her voice trembling with fury but calculated for effect. He could evict us from the playground tomorrow. He could demand thousands in back rent. He's an outsider. He doesn't care about us. He only cares about leverage. I wasn't in the room, but the words carried through open windows, across the grass, and into my chest like knives. When the crowd poured out afterward, faces were hard, whispers sharper than ever. Conversations died when I walked past. People looked at me like I was the wolf at their door. Later that night, Frank and I lingered outside the cabin, listening to the fatting noise from the community center on my land. And that's when we saw them. Mary and Rebecca standing together under the parking lot lights, speaking in low voices. I moved closer, staying in the shadows, the gravel crunching under my boots threatening to betray me. But then I caught Rebecca's words, her tone colder than I'd ever heard it. "Don't worry about property law," she told Mary, her hand resting on her shoulder like a pact. "I have methods that work much better. By next week he'll be begging to sell at any price." Her smile in that moment wasn't neighborly, it was predatory. That night I lay awake on the old mattress, staring at the ceiling fan as it clicked and whined. My uncle's letter, his notes, the survey maps, they weren't just warnings. They were a battle plan. He hadn't been paranoid. He'd been preparing me. Rebecca thought I was just another vulnerable target. She thought grief and isolation would wear me down. What she didn't count on was that Uncle Jim had already shown me her playbook. The following morning I woke up to something eerie. Silence. Too much silence. No kids waiting for the bus, no neighbors walking dogs, no cars starting up. The street was empty, as if the entire community had conspired overnight. Driving to work, I found out the truth. They had rerouted themselves. Parents organized carpools, commuters adjusted schedules, everyone avoided passing my cabin. They weren't just avoiding me, they were erasing me. At the grocery store, the clerk avoided eye contact. The manager pulled me aside, awkward and apologetic. "Some customers feel uncomfortable with your presence. Maybe, for now, you could shop during off-peak hours." That walk back to my truck felt like carrying a boulder on my chest. Every door that closed, every look that lingered, every whisper that followed. Rebecca's methods weren't about legal fights. They were about breaking me until I gave up. But here's the thing about isolation. It can crush you, or it can harden you. That evening, headlights swept across my porch. Rebecca stepped out of her car, confident, carrying the same false smile she'd worn since day one. "Charles," she called sweetly, "this doesn't have to keep escalating. The community is worried about you. Isolation makes people do desperate things." Her tone dripped with feigned concern, but every word was a threat wrapped in kindness. She was rewriting my story before I even had a chance to live it. I stood there listening, and something shifted inside me. Fear gave way to clarity. I wasn't just up against nosy neighbors or HOA red tape. I was up against professionals who weaponized paranoia, who turned communities against their own. And if Uncle Jim could fight as long as he did, even sick and alone, then I could fight too. Kevin Torres showed up at my door just after sunrise. His knock was heavy, uneven, almost like he wasn't sure if he wanted me to answer. When I opened it, he stood there gripping a manila folder to his chest like it was a lifeline. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands shaking. "Charles," he muttered, voice cracking, "I need to show you something." We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Uncle Jim once drank his morning coffee. Kevin spread the papers across it, his fingers trembling as he pushed them toward me. "Mary asked me to grab some HOA files from her house yesterday," he admitted. "But this wasn't HOA paperwork." What I saw made my stomach drop. These weren't simple neighborhood notes. They were intelligence reports, detailed files on every single family in the community. Work schedules, financial struggles, relationship issues, even overheard arguments. Kevin had unknowingly documented every vulnerability, every pressure point. "I thought I was protecting the neighborhood," Kevin whispered, guilt spilling out of him like a confession. "But I was feeding them ammo. I gave them a map of how to break people." He leaned back in the chair, running both hands through his hair, his breathing uneven. They used my training against me, Charles. I thought I was doing security assessments, but I was conducting surveillance on my own neighbors. His words hit me harder than I expected, because in that moment I realized Kevin wasn't a villain. He was another pawn in their game, a broken soldier desperate for purpose, twisted into an enforcer without even knowing it. Then Kevin told me about the phone call he'd overheard in Mary's home office, her voice, sharp and businesslike, carrying through the half-open door. "We're ahead of schedule on the Moore property," she'd said. "Rebecca's pressure campaign is working better than expected. We'll have him ready to sell within weeks. Once we get that 6.2-acre parcel, we can move on to Phase 2. Phase 2. The words made my blood run cold. This wasn't just about me. This was a machine designed to consume every vulnerable person on this street. That night, Frank came over with something even heavier. He'd gone back to the waterproof containers in Uncle Jim's basement, determined to dig deeper. What he found wasn't just notes, it was recordings. Uncle Jim, in his final months, had hidden a small recorder in his living room. On those tapes, Rebecca's voice was clear as day. Calm, calculated venom behind her silk tone. "I've got 50 grand in casino debt," she confessed on one of them. "This elderly targeting system is the fastest way out. I move in where someone's sick, earn their trust, make them question themselves. By the time the will changes hands, they don't even realize it's not their idea." Hearing her voice like that, it wasn't just chilling, it was proof. And then came Mary's turn. Another recording, this time with her low, deliberate tone. "Rebecca applies the pressure. I create the paper trail. The beauty is, the HOA gives us cover. Nobody questions us when we say it's about community safety." I sat there in the basement, headphones pressing against my ears, my uncle's voice faint in the background as he played the role of a confused old man baiting them to talk. My chest tightened with both grief and rage. He'd known what was happening, but he was too sick to fight back. So he documented everything, hoping someday it would matter. And now it was all in my hands. But Rebecca wasn't finished. She pivoted again. When word of Uncle Jim's recording started leaking through whispers, she went nuclear. She accused me of the unthinkable, elder abuse. She told anyone who'd listen that I'd manipulated my dying uncle into changing his will, that I'd isolated him, that I had a financial motive for his death. Her words spread like poison. By the time the detective called, my name was already stained. Detective Morgan's voice was steady, professional, but heavy with obligation. "Mr. Moore, we've received a report suggesting your uncle's death may involve suspicious circumstances. We'll need to ask you some questions." And just like that, I went from victim to suspect. The interviews were brutal. They asked me to explain my uncle's mental state, why neighbors described him as paranoid. They asked why I'd suddenly become more involved in his life after years of distance. Every question was logical, but it felt like being accused of betraying the man I'd loved most. There were nights I sat alone at the cabin table, staring at Uncle Jim's old coffee mug, feeling the crushing weight of it all. Divorce had broken me once, but this was different. This was an attempt to erase me completely. But then light broke through. Dr. Lena, Uncle Jim's hospice physician, provided detailed records. She confirmed he'd been sharp until the end, that he'd spoken often of me, grateful I was there, that he'd specifically expressed fear of neighbors prying into his affairs. Her testimony dismantled Rebecca's lies. And then the real investigation began, not into me, but into Rebecca. Detective Morgan dug into her background. What he found was worse than any of us imagined. Rebecca wasn't just a manipulative neighbor. She was a serial predator, 3 states, 4 communities. Each time she'd moved in after someone got sick. Each time she'd wormed her way into wills, estate plans, or forced sales. And each time she'd walked away richer, leaving broken families behind. The police pieced it together. Fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy. Rebecca Shaw wasn't unlucky company. She was a career criminal hiding behind a casserole dish. And Mary, the recording sealed her fate, her own voice betraying her, her own arrogance leaving a trail she couldn't erase. That night I sat on the porch, listening to the crickets starring out over land I'd almost lost. I thought of my uncle, his shaky handwriting, his tired eyes, his quiet resilience. He hadn't just left me property. He'd left me a fight. And I was finally ready to step into it. The morning the subpoenas arrived, the neighborhood changed forever. Two unmarked cars rolled slowly into the cul-de-sac, their engines humming low. The sound of doors shutting echoed down the street like a gavel striking wood. Detectives in plain clothes walked calmly, deliberately past the trimmed hedges and plastic lawn flamingos. Every curtain in the neighborhood twitched. Children were pulled inside. Dogs barked nervously. And there on Mary Pierce's porch they knocked. I stood half-hidden behind my cabin's gate, my boots sinking into the damp earth, heart pounding. Watching her open the door was like seeing a stage actress caught off script. Her perfect hair slightly out of place, her smile too stiff, her voice too high as she greeted them. The officers didn't smile back. They handed her a packet thick enough to choke on. Subpoena. For the first time since I moved here, Mary didn't have words. Her hand shook as she clutched the papers, her voice breaking when she tried to argue. The officers didn't argue back. They simply turned and left, their job done, leaving her standing in the doorway, stripped of authority. An hour later, the same happened at Rebecca's house. But she was different. Rebecca didn't panic, she didn't cry. She leaned against the frame with that cold smile like she had rehearsed this moment too. She signed the receipt, thanked the officer, and even waved goodbye, as if none of it touched her. That was the moment I realized. Rebecca didn't fear consequences, she thrived in chaos. By evening, the neighborhood was split in half. Some rushed to distance themselves from Mary and Rebecca, whispering that they never really trusted them anyway. Others doubled down, convinced that I had orchestrated everything, that I was using lawyers and dirty tricks to destroy the community from the inside out. At the grocery store, two mothers argued in the aisle, their carts abandoned. One shouted that Rebecca had saved her family from foreclosure years ago. The other screamed back that Rebecca was a parasite. And everyone turned their heads when I walked by, whispering, wondering, deciding whether I was the hero or the villain in this story. I wanted to believe justice was finally working, that the walls were closing in on them. But that night when I came home, I found my front gate swinging wide open. The lock snapped clean off. Inside the cabin, nothing was stolen, nothing broken. But someone had been there, papers on my desk had been shifted. The flashlight in the corner wasn't where I'd left it. Even the chair at the kitchen table had been pulled back just slightly. It wasn't robbery, it was a message. Rebecca wanted me to know she could reach me, even now, even under investigation. I sat on the porch until dawn. The rifle Uncle Jim left me laid across my knees, my eyes burning as I stared into the dark. Every sound of a branch snapping, every crunch of gravel had me gripping that stock tighter. Sleep was gone, trust was gone, but resolve, that was all I had left. The next day, Frank arrived with news that cut deeper than any break-in. He'd been cornered by Kevin, who had relapsed, booze heavy on his breath, eyes red. Kevin begged him for help, said Mary and Rebecca had promised him money to stay loyal, promised him they'd take care of him if the walls came down. He's cracking, Frank said quietly, leaning on my porch rail. But if he breaks the wrong way, they'll use him as their scapegoat. He's unstable, Charles, and unstable people are easy to sacrifice. I knew Frank was right. Kevin was a liability to them now, a pawn they could discard. And if Rebecca had no fear of subpoenas, she'd have no fear of burning Kevin alive to protect herself. That evening I heard shouting across the cul-de-sac. Kevin, staggering, yelling at Mary on her front lawn. His words were slurred but clear enough. You used me. You promised me a job, promised me purpose. And now you're leaving me to take the fall. Neighbors peeked through blinds. Kids were pulled back indoors. Mary hissed at him to keep his voice down, her mask of control cracking with every second. Then the sound of sirens. Two police cruisers rolled in, lights flashing against the tidy fences and manicured lawns. Officers stepped out, their voices calm but firm. Kevin raised his hands, shouting he hadn't done anything wrong, that it was all Mary and Rebecca. But he was cuffed, shoved into the back of the car, his voice muffled as the door slammed shut. Rebecca stood in her driveway, watching. That same cold smile, arms crossed. Because to her, Kevin wasn't a friend, wasn't an ally. He was a loose thread finally snipped. And as the cruisers drove away, the neighborhood seemed quieter than ever. Too quiet. That night I walked the property lines with a flashlight, tracing the survey markers my uncle had set years ago. Each metal stake hammered into the ground felt like a reminder. This was mine, my inheritance, my responsibility, and for the first time I spoke it out loud to the night air. They can't take this from me. But Rebecca wasn't finished. 2 days later, glossy flyers appeared on every doorstep, professionally printed, full color. My face plastered across the front under bold letters. Unstable landlord threatens our community. The bullet points were vicious. Claims that I planned to bulldoze the playground, that I'd already contacted developers to sell off the land, that I had a violent temper, a history of mental health issues, a pattern of manipulating vulnerable people. Every word a lie, but lies have power when they're delivered in color ink. I found one stuck to my windshield at work. My boss saw it before I did. He didn't fire me, but the conversation was short. "I don't know what's going on with you," he said, "but I can't afford this attention. Keep it out of the office, Charles, or you're gone." Rebecca's plan was working again. She didn't need to win in court. She just needed to make my life unlivable. That night I sat at my uncle's desk, the cassette recording spread out before me. His voice crackled through the old player, tired but steady. "Charles, if you're hearing this, it means they've come for you too. Don't let them turn you into the villain. The truth is your weapon. Use it." And in that moment, I realized Uncle Jim hadn't just left me evidence. He'd left me a path forward. I picked up my phone and called the detective. "I have recordings," I said, my voice steady. "You're going to want to hear this." Detective Morgan arrived at the cabin just after dusk. His unmarked sedan pulled up quietly, headlights fatting as he stepped out with a small recorder in his hand. He didn't wear a uniform, just a button-down shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, the weariness of too many cases etched into his face. I led him inside, the floorboards groaning under our weight. On the table sat Uncle Jim's cassettes, the survey maps, the notes, all spread out like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be solved. Morgan slid a tape into the player, pressed the button, and the room filled with Rebecca's voice. Calm, calculated, deadly. Elderly targets are easiest when they're isolated. You make them doubt their own memory, their own judgment. Once they start second-guessing themselves, you can lead them anywhere. The detective didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on the recorder, jaw tight. The next tape, Mary's voice, sharp and self-righteous. "As long as we frame it as community safety, no one questions us. The HOA is the perfect cover. It gives us authority without accountability." The tape clicked off. Silence filled the cabin. Only the hum of the refrigerator in the corner broke the tension. Morgan finally exhaled. "Mr. Moore, what you have here, this isn't just neighbor drama. This is organized exploitation. And if even half of what's on these tapes checks out, we're looking at conspiracy, fraud, elder abuse, maybe even racketeering." For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't dared let myself feel. Hope. But hope was fragile. The very next day, the HOA board called a community-wide meeting. Not in the community center this time, but on the lawn in front of Mary's house. Folding chairs lined up, speakers set on stands. It looked less like a meeting and more like a rally. I didn't go, but I didn't need to. Their voices carried across the cul-de-sac, through the open windows of my cabin. Mary stood at the front, clutching her microphone like a preacher with a congregation. "This man is trying to dismantle our community," she thundered. "He claims ownership over land that belongs to our children. He fabricates lies to smear our names. He calls the police on his own neighbors. Is this the kind of person we want dictating our future?" The crowd roared, some clapping, others jeering. Fear and anger blended until you couldn't tell one from the other. Then Rebecca stepped forward, her tone softer, smoother, every word crafted to sound like compassion. "I worry about Charles," she said, shaking her head like a concerned sister. "I think the divorce broke him more than he admits. His uncle's death has left him unstable. He doesn't need land, he needs help." It was genius, not just painting me as a villain, but as someone broken, unfit to be trusted. And when Kevin's arrest was mentioned, they framed it perfectly. Our security officer cracked under Charles's influence. He was manipulated just like Jim was. Standing in the shadows of my porch, I clenched my fists. Every word they spoke was poison. But it was spreading, infecting the neighborhood faster than truth could keep up. That night, Frank sat with me, his voice low. They're trying to bury you in reputation so the law doesn't matter. Even if the tapes hold, if the community testifies against you, it muddies everything. They know perception is power. I looked down at the survey maps, the recordings, the papers. My uncle's handwriting blurred through tears I didn't even realize were falling. Frank, they killed him slowly. They made him doubt himself until he had nothing left. And now they want to do the same to me. Frank reached across the table, his hand heavy, trembling but steady enough. Then don't give them the satisfaction. Fight louder. Make the truth louder than their lies. The next morning, I did something that terrified me. I called the local paper. A young reporter named Angela came out, her notepad full, her eyes sharp. She listened as I laid it all out. The surveys, the tapes, the letters, the break-ins, the flyers. She listened without judgment, only interrupting to ask clarifying questions. When she left, she promised to look into it. I wasn't sure if she'd actually print anything, but for the first time, the story wasn't just theirs. By the weekend, everything cracked wide open. Detective Morgan came back with a search warrant. Officers swarmed Mary's house, hauling out boxes of files. Neighbors stood on their lawns, whispering as they watched authority shift in real time. The queen of the HOA, her perfect world stripped bare under flashing lights. At Rebecca's place, it was worse. Computers, hard drives, folders stuffed with names and numbers, evidence of her reaching far beyond this neighborhood. And still she smiled, as if even handcuffs couldn't touch her. But that night when the news broke, the tide finally shifted. Angela's article ran online first, then in print. Headline bold: Local HOA tied to exploitation scheme, recordings reveal abuse of elderly homeowners. The article quoted the tapes directly. It outlined Rebecca's history in other states, Mary's manipulation, Kevin's coerced role. And in the final paragraphs, it told my uncle's story, his fight, his warnings, his legacy. The next morning, copies of the paper landed on every doorstep. Neighbors picked them up with trembling hands, eyes scanning the words that exposed the people they'd trusted most. For the first time since I arrived, no one avoided me. Some wouldn't meet my eyes, ashamed. Others crossed the street to whisper apologies. A few even thanked me for holding on when they hadn't believed me. Justice wasn't complete yet, but the silence had broken. Still, Rebecca wasn't done. Even with evidence mounting, she refused to bend. Her lawyers filed motions, painted her as the victim of a vindictive neighbor. She walked the sidewalks with her head high, telling anyone who'd listen that the recordings were doctored, that I was staging an elaborate scam to steal land. But her mask was cracking. I saw it one evening as the sun dipped low and painted the street gold. She stood in her driveway, arms crossed, talking on her phone. When she noticed me watching, her smile didn't come. For the first time, she looked rattled. And I knew then the tide had finally turned. The day of the court hearing, the sky was heavy with gray clouds, the kind that feel like they're waiting for a signal before they break. I stood outside the courthouse steps with Frank at my side. The survey maps rolled under my arm, Uncle Jim's cassettes tucked into my bag like sacred relics. My boots scraped against the stone steps, every sound echoing louder than it should. Rebecca arrived first. She stepped out of a black SUV in a tailored navy suit, sunglasses covering her eyes though the sky offered no sun. She walked like the cameras were for her, chin up, shoulders squared, that same predator's confidence radiating off her. Behind her, Mary Pierce climbed out of her sedan, visibly shaken, her hands clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. The reporters swarmed, microphones stretched forward, flashes popped. "Ms. Shaw, what do you say to the accusations of elder abuse?" one shouted. She smiled as if the question were a compliment. "Baseless lies," she replied smoothly. "This is nothing more than a land dispute twisted by someone unstable." Inside, the air was thick, the wood-paneled walls holding a silence that felt older than justice itself. The judge, stern and unreadable, entered with the slow weight of authority. When he called the case, my name against theirs, the room seemed to lean in. The prosecution started with the tapes. Mary's voice filled the courtroom, her arrogance undeniable as she bragged about weaponizing the HOA. Then Rebecca's confession, casual and cold, describing exploitation as if it were business strategy. Every juror shifted uncomfortably. Some shook their heads. Rebecca's lawyer fought hard. He called me unstable, painted me as a bitter man using grief as a weapon. He pointed to my divorce, my financial struggles, my supposed temper. And for a moment, I felt the room tilt. I felt the old doubts creeping in. What if they believed her? What if all my uncle's evidence wasn't enough? Then Detective Morgan took the stand. His testimony was steady, factual, damning. He laid out Rebecca's history in 3 states, the pattern too precise to be coincidence. He presented the files taken from Mary's house, HOA documents doctored, signatures forged, fines issued on properties they had no legal control over. Piece by piece, the illusion cracked. When it was my turn, I stood slowly, hands trembling. The microphone felt too close, my voice too raw, but I told them the truth, about my uncle's last days, about the letter he left me, the way his words shook but his message never did. About the night I found the recordings, his voice rising from the grave to warn me. I didn't give them speeches. I gave them silence between words, pauses heavy with grief, the kind that no one can fake. I wanted them to hear what it felt like to lose someone twice, once to death and once to lies. When I finished, the courtroom was quiet. Even Rebecca's mask faltered for a second, her jaw tightening. The verdict didn't come that day. The judge recessed, promising a decision after review, but outside the weight had already shifted. Neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid me now walked up, hesitant but genuine. Some apologized. Some offered food, as if kindness could erase weeks of cruelty. One older woman, tears in her eyes, whispered, "I should have believed your uncle. I should have believed you." Rebecca, though, wasn't finished. That night she showed up at my cabin. No casserole this time, no smile. Just her, standing in the glow of my porch light, her eyes burning with venom. "You think you've won?" she hissed. "You don't understand how deep this goes. People like me don't lose. We adapt. We survive. You're just a man clinging to a shack and a dead man's words." Her voice shook, not with fear but with rage. The mask was gone, the predator exposed. I didn't argue, I didn't rise. I simply closed the door and locked it. For the first time, it was her voice echoing through the night, not mine. The next morning, the final blow came. Angela, the reporter, had dug deeper. She published an exposé not just on Rebecca's HOA scams, but on her financials, gambling debts, hidden accounts, offshore transfers. The picture was clear now. Rebecca wasn't just manipulative. She was desperate, a predator feeding her own bottomless hunger. And the community, they turned fast. Parents pulled their kids from her after-school programs. Neighbors who once defended her crossed the street without looking back. Mary's house went dark, curtains drawn tight, as if she could hide from the world she once ruled. That evening the police came back, not for me, for her. Rebecca was led away in handcuffs, still trying to smile for cameras, still insisting she was the victim. But the cracks were too wide now. The world had seen her for what she was. I stood on my porch, Frank beside me, the dusk painting the sky in shades of orange and red. For the first time in months, the air felt lighter. And yet deep inside, I knew this wasn't the end. Because predators like Rebecca don't simply vanish. They leave scars, they leave echoes, and the community would carry those echoes for years. But as I looked out across the 6 acres my uncle had left me, the land he fought to protect, I whispered a promise into the wind. They'll never take this from us again. The day the verdict came down, the air felt different. Crisp, almost electric, like the world was holding its breath. I sat in the courtroom again, hands folded, eyes fixed on the judge as he read the ruling. His voice was steady, deliberate, each word a stone laid on a path I'd been walking for months. Rebecca Shaw, guilty on multiple counts of fraud, elder exploitation, and conspiracy. Mary Pierce, guilty of aiding and abetting, misuse of HOA funds, and falsifying records. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. And just like that, the empire they built on lies collapsed into dust. Rebecca didn't flinch. She stood tall, lips pressed into a thin line, eyes locked on me like a wolf refusing to bow even in chains. Mary, on the other hand, broke completely. She sobbed into her hands, her body shaking as deputies led her away. For all her bluster, she had never been built for consequences. When it was over, I walked out of that courthouse into the sunlight, the weight on my chest finally lifting. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but I didn't stop. I didn't owe anyone more words. My uncle's story had been told, and that was enough. Back at the cabin, the land felt different too. Not because it had changed, but because I finally saw it for what it was, a legacy. Uncle Jim hadn't just left me property. He'd left me a responsibility to stand where he no longer could, to hold the line when predators came knocking. The neighbors started trickling by in the weeks after. Some brought pies, casseroles, awkward smiles. Others just shook my hand, no words needed. A few admitted their shame, confessing how easily they'd been swayed by fear, how quickly they'd turned their backs. I didn't hold it against them. Fear makes people blind, and Rebecca knew exactly how to weaponize it. The HOA disbanded quietly, its meetings dissolved, its bank accounts frozen by the court. The playground stayed. The community center stayed. But now they stayed because I allowed it, because I owned the ground beneath them. And for the first time, people realized their safety didn't come from rules or fines or Mary's booming voice. It came from truth. One evening, I found myself on the porch with Frank again. He smoked in silence, the ember of his cigarette glowing in the dark. Finally, he said, "Jim would be proud, you know." I looked out across the yard, the survey stakes glinting faintly in the moonlight. "He'd probably tell me I took too long," I said with a laugh, but then my voice caught. "I just wish he'd been here to see it." Frank nodded, his eyes heavy. "Sometimes justice doesn't come when we want it, but it comes, and that's enough." Life didn't snap back to normal overnight. Scars don't heal that fast. Some neighbors still kept their distance. Others tried too hard, overcompensating for their silence when I needed them most. But in the quiet moments, when the crickets sang, when the wind pushed through the pines, when the gate creaked open just like it had on my first day back, I felt something I hadn't in years: peace. One Saturday morning, I walked the property lines again. My boots pressed into the earth, following the same path Uncle Jim must have walked countless times. At the far edge, near the playground, a group of kids were laughing, chasing each other in circles. Their parents stood nearby, talking casually, no fear in their voices anymore. One little boy stopped and waved at me. "Thanks for letting us play here, Mr. Moore." I smiled and tipped my cap. "It's your place too, kiddo, just take care of it." And in that moment, I understood something my uncle had tried to teach me all along. Land isn't about control. It's about stewardship, about protecting something bigger than yourself. Rebecca Shaw thought power came from fear. Mary thought power came from authority. But the truth? Real power comes from responsibility, from the quiet choice to do right even when it costs you everything. That night I sat at my uncle's old desk, the same creaky chair under me, the same smell of pine and dust in the air. I pulled out his letter, the one written in his shaky hand, and read it again. His words weren't just warnings anymore. They were blessings. "Charles, if you're reading this, I failed to protect what matters most. Time is running out." I folded the letter gently, placed it back in its envelope, and whispered to the empty room, "It's safe now, Uncle Jim. I kept it safe." The crickets sang louder outside, as if answering. In the end, I didn't win because I was stronger. I didn't win because I had more money or louder friends or sharper lawyers. I won because I didn't give up. Because I believed one man's truth could outlast 100 lies. And that's the lesson I carry with me every day now. Predators will always circle. Fear will always whisper. But if you stand firm, if you hold on to dignity, to patience, to truth, they can't take what's yours. They tried to bury me in lies. But all they did was plant me deeper in the soil my uncle left behind. And I grew roots. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.